Hi, I'm Conor Kelly O'Brien. I am an actor, writer, and I am the co-founder and executive director of our very own Scranton Fringe Festival. And I'm here talking with musician, artist, and audio engineer Justin Padro. Justin, how are you?
Doing well. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks for coming by today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Okay, so we have a lot of ground to cover.
Sure.
And I want to make sure we get to all the exciting things that you've done and you're working on. So let's start the best place at the beginning. Where did you grow up?
I was born in Brooklyn, in Fort Greene, and I grew up in Brooklyn, and then we moved to Queens, to Ridgewood, and then to Woodhaven.
Wow.
There was this sort of progress of like, both my parents, worked full time, and it was just sort of this thing where there was, it seems almost impossible to think about today as a reality, but this idea of social upward mobility and there being a middle class and moving as they got, rose in the ranks of their jobs, moved us to better neighborhoods. So like, we lived in some places, but I didn't know that as a kid so much. I had a pretty awesome childhood for where we lived at certain points.
When you say you didn't know it as a kid, you mean you didn't?
I didn't pay attention to it. It wasn't a part of my, you know what I mean? Like there was, some things that would happen, like little shocks to the system, but mostly I was protected from that.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
That's a tribute to your parents.
Yeah.
Clearly, and the environment. Where are your parents still in Queens?
They moved to Staten Island, and like a lot of, I think, people from New York who were trying to empty nest and like, they want a home, they want a house, and they want to be able to afford it. So
I've heard a lot of people joke around that Staten Island is the retirement center of.
It's something. I mean, I think like where they live right now is it is kind of a retirement neighborhood because it's mostly fire department and NYPD. So it's a very quiet block.
Is that the careers your parents worked in?
No, my mom is still working at Polytechnic University.
Okay.
She works for, I forget exactly who at the moment.
That's fine.
My father he does more part-time work now, I think, which is another thing that I think we see in, our older communities today, having to, not really being able to retire properly, in my opinion. But anyway, he was a union guy for as long as I can remember, worked for the New York Telephone Company, which had many names in my lifetime. There was the New York Telephone Company, Bell Atlantic, 9X, and then Verizon. That's not the right order. But I remember as a kid when he went on strike and things like that, and I understood what that was, and I was really proud of him and stuff. And I eventually became a member of the Yahtzee local here, 239.
And for those who don't know what that union is?
That is International Association of Theatrical and Stage Employees. So a lot of concerts and musicals, plays, theater, everything from setting up props to hanging lights and speakers at Montage Mountain, doing rigging. That's exciting work that I do some of the time.
So would you say that joining a union was a natural step for you,
Yeah.
having growing up with
Well, yeah, I think with the just sort of understanding the politics of it and understanding just the goodness of that idea.
I agree.
And it became pretty clear, I think, moving out here, trying to juggle work and I've always had about 2 or 3 different jobs. So it became clear that some consistency was very important, and how over probably 10, 15 years, 20 years, more and more places are just sort of doing that thing where they cycle people through part-time employment and then push them out when the benefits come rolling around or whatever. It's a scary thing. It's not a good state for where we are now.
We are absolutely going to come back to that subject. But just to give everyone the full arc of your journey, so you grew up in New York. You went to Columbia University, correct?
Yes.
What did you study at Columbia?
I studied literature. I was a big fan of literature. I was originally interested in, and I realized the folly of the title itself, it's studying ethnomusicology. I was going to try to double major in music and anthropology, and the anthropology department was very interesting, but at that time, I guess it would have been 2000, the music department wasn't very diverse. It was more influenced by classical and new classical music, which is great. and I learned plenty hanging around there.
When you say classical and new classical, please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm assuming that that's probably very Eurocentric.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Or
for sure.
in layman's terms, white.
There were some interesting courses on like South Asian and East Asian music and things like that, and I studied, and it was awesome. But it wasn't really until about 2 or 3 years into my time there that they started to take jazz seriously, and they actually started to hire people to teach it.
What do you attribute the university's shift in respecting that genre and giving it more attention?
I'm not sure exactly what happened. I mean, I'd like to pretend I was a part of that, but I'm not so sure about that either.
Maybe.
I know that I was interested in the joint program between Juilliard and Columbia, and when I was trying to approach Juilliard, they were also very much like, no, what's jazz? And I think that changed thanks to Wynton Marsalis and Stanley Crouch and Albert Murray, the sort of triumvirate of relatively conservative jazz historians. They, Jazz at Lincoln Center became a thing, and they were starting to maybe say, hey, Juilliard, why don't you get on the boat?
That's so funny to think of jazz as like recently becoming respected by these institutions.
Right, well, that was a big campaign. I mean, Ken Burns was a part of it, too.
Interesting.
With his documentary series, and I don't know the details of it, but I definitely was, while I was at Columbia, I felt that happening. And it was just, the idea of defining jazz as America's classical music became a big deal.
Yeah, it's funny that you bring that up. I was just having a conversation with an old friend of mine who we studied improv together in New York. And we were talking about, he has moved to London and he's been doing a lot of improv there, and just how, even though it's such a relatively new art form, even here in America, but how much more accepted it is here than there. Okay. And it kind of brought up this conversation of improvisation or fluid art forms in that respect. Yeah. And I'm not going to say jazz and improv are that similar, but in the sense that
they're related.
They're related, and in the sense that they kind of both have that, jazz is to the classical music world what a lot of people in the, traditional theater world consider improv.
Sure.
It's just that thing. And it was interesting to see how improvisation in every form and the fluidity of that is such an American. Do you know what I mean? Like,
no, it's a good argument to make. I mean, I remember I've always been fascinated by painters, and I'm not one at all. But I remember that really kicked in when my father. I was about 10 years old or something, and my father brought me to the Basquiat retrospect at the Whitney, and that changed my world.
Wow.
I was like, wow, I understand this. I can, because it's interesting when you start sort of seeing paint visual language as a language, and you can kind of communicate with it. And it took somebody, another Puerto Rican, who's Puerto Rican Haitian from Brooklyn, to kind of make that connection, I guess.
What was it about the work that particularly spoke to you?
Well, the use of a lot of signifying and like symbolism, and a lot of like the relationship that I've known all my life with graffiti, and like one of my older brothers was, I think it's okay to say now, a graffiti writer. It's years ago, many years ago. But
I'm sure they have other priorities.
Through that, I ended up eventually just like really getting turned on to painters, and I remember it was sort of an unofficial thesis that I wrote about synesthesia and about free jazz, American free jazz in the 60s in particular, and abstract American expressionists. And just the relation, the obvious cue here is Jackson Pollock, right? So the idea of fluidity, very obvious, and the idea of improvising. I mean, these were people that were going to the 5 spot and seeing Thelonious Monk, and all this stuff was going. He was painting often to the tune of like Louis Armstrong records. So I see the connection very vividly, and there's this. It's all about, in a way, trying to wrestle form out of the abstract, and about the value of that improvisation as a key part of the process in creating the art, not just the final product. It's sort of like wrestling order from chaos, right? I guess.
I'm curious to know, with all the touchstones that you just mentioned and all the references that inspired you. Going back to the beginning of your career as a musician, what was, and you can answer this however you want, what was the first instrument you picked up? Who was the first thing you ever heard that was like, oh, like really sparked? Because you've mentioned a ton, but a lot of those references seem to have come to you through your professional training and career.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
curious to know, like, day one for you, who was it? What instrument was it?
I think it was the first instrument was timbales, which are a very interesting instrument, actually, with a funny history. The timbales are, like Tito Puente is probably the most famous timbale player, right?
Okay.
So they're these metal shell drums, and unlike drum sets, they don't have double heads. They don't have two sides. They just have the one head, and then it's open underneath. And you play the sides, and obviously you play on them, and you can play you usually have at least one cowbell attached for a certain section of the song, of structure of like, any kind of like salsa, cha-cha. I learned all that stuff.
Self-taught, or did someone teach
Well,
you?
no. The drums were primarily self-taught.
Okay.
I eventually moved to drum set, but that was thanks to Ralph Irizarry, this timbale player who was most famous for working with Ray Barretto and Ruben Blades, I think. And he also has other projects that came after that were more Latin jazz projects that are really interesting, innovative, cool bands like Seis del Solar and Timbalayer. Those are a couple of his bands. Really quick about the timbales.
Go for it.
As far as I know, there was this form of music called danza, and eventually we called it danzón, and it kind of evolved. But I'd say in the 18th century, it was popular amongst like the wealthy French in Haiti, and so I'm fairly certain this is the truth. And like, I guess usually they were using timpani, which are big, heavy, annoying, cumbersome instruments, and they just kind of were like, well, how about we just cut them in half, and we'll still get the same, similar timbre, like, and we'll be able to play the rhythm that makes the whole thing it's a waltz rhythm, basically.
Okay.
It's that kind of thing, a very old school European thing. So I guess out of that necessity came the sort of eventually the contemporary timbales, and I think as a result of slave rebellions, French who escaped and then came to Cuba brought a lot of that culture with them, and then that evolved into other forms of music. Anyway, so I was, I guess, at 8 or 9 or something like that, I started on timbales because I wanted to play drums, and my father was like, well, yeah, that's cool, but first I want you to learn about your culture. I want you to learn about this stuff. So that you have that, and I knew he was right, and I was like, well, and it was just more cool stuff to do, so I was like, yeah, sure, okay, no problem. So that was fun. But yeah, through that, I kind of got turned on to jazz, Motown. I grew up with salsa, hip hop, especially for my older brothers, a lot of rap.
What hip hop and rap artists?
Let's see, I think like my first favorite was probably Big Daddy Kane.
Okay.
Ain't No Half Steppin', and Set It Off, which starts with this amazing a cappella that he just rolls into, and it just has this great driving, very like late 80s, almost New Jack kind of beat, which is cool.
Who more recently in the rap and hip hop world is speaking to you?
Well, that's actually pretty cool. I've been able to like work with a lot of hip hop artists actually.
Oh, great.
Through the sound engineering thing in particular. When I was in New York, doing that really heavily. I was working places like The Flat in Brooklyn, Tammany Hall, which I don't think exists anymore in Lower Manhattan. And a lot of that was like a mix of, I was doing booking at The Flat, and I would do more like punk and experimental and indie rock influenced stuff, but there was always showcase type activities. There was always like parties that would have DJs and mostly dancing, but would have like a few rappers show up. I remember I got to work I did some work a few times for the Flatbush Zombies, and they blew up, and that was cool. They always brought a whole entourage onto the stage at Tammany Hall, and I was always like, oh my God, please don't break my mics. There's a lot of people up there, but they were amazing. And this guy, Cakes the Killer, who is one of the like few openly gay black rappers in the game. And he, amongst a number of other really talented MCs from all over the place, would do a lot of stuff at the Flat. And those were always fun. And it was cool to be a part of it and to like appreciate it. And then like before they kind of made it. And now both those groups are kicking butt. It's really cool to see.
Very cool. Bringing it back home to you a little bit more. So before we did the interview, we had a quick little prep chat, and you mentioned, so you've lived obviously in New York City throughout the boroughs. You've lived near Boston.
Yes.
You live now in Scranton, Pennsylvania, but somewhere before Scranton, Pennsylvania, you lived in Beijing, China.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about what got you there and what you were doing there?
Well, at the time, I guess there was a period. I went to Columbia, and and while I was there, I met some people there, like other students, and one professor in particular who was just like he was like really cool with this group of older students that I used to hang with, and we would like hang out on some Sundays all together in a group and talk about music and art and economics. He was an economics professor, and still is. Eventually, he eventually left Columbia and went to China and taught at a couple of the major universities there. And while he was there, this guy's name is Michael Pettis, by the way. Sorry. He had in the '80s had like a punk joint, like a dive in Lower Manhattan. Called Sin, I think it was called. And Thurston Moore from Sonic Youth used to be the door guy. And that became an interesting thing. We eventually brought them to China and like sent a Chinese band with them on tour in Europe and America and stuff. So that was a cool thing. But so he had always wanted to facilitate that again, like have a place for artists to come and work on their stuff, only original music. Very CBGB's kind of deal. And he basically saw that there was an opportunity in Beijing to do that. He saw a lot of young artists who just didn't have a spot to do this stuff. And also these artists don't necessarily have access to the internet changed some things, but there's a lot of censure there.
Okay.
But they don't have necessarily access to the resources that I did growing up in America and hearing all this stuff all the time. So he opened up a spot, and it started to take off. And I guess about 6 months into the whole time, he'd been asking me to come to China. And I was like, at that point, I was playing in the subways full time with a brass band that combined second line New Orleans New Orleans jazz with punk. It was a sousaphone, trumpet, and a trumpet player who also sang through a megaphone. And I played a strap snare drum.
When you say you did that full time, I'm just curious. What did that what would the average week look like for you?
It was a hustle.
Okay.
It was a heavy hustle.
Because I see those, because I'm living in New York now.
It was a very mobile job.
So would you stay in, what stations would you primarily?
Man, it depended on the time of year and the time of day and how desperate we were.
If we flash back to this day that many years ago.
It's cold outside, so we're gonna definitely hit the subways, and we're probably gonna hit them a little too early. Okay. So we'd start in the Bronx mostly because the tuba player and we were called the Stumblebum Brass Band. That eventually continued without me in different form, and I've always had love for them. But it was a very unique thing at that time. And then later on, you saw people like Too Many Zoos and that sort of thing popping up. But like before that, it was really raw, and there were no permits and things like that.
I was gonna say, now you see it. There's in certain stations. They're sponsored by the city.
Right. No. But we weren't having that either. We didn't want to relegate ourselves to that. And we would go to the Bronx, to Manhattan, to Brooklyn. We'd go up into Astoria. There was this great beer garden in Astoria that loved us, and we'd do a lot of stuff there.
Fascinating.
We got around.
Cool. I apologize. I didn't mean to get off track too much, but that was just a really interesting subject. I didn't want to miss that. So, we're in China.
Right. So at a certain point, that really is a lifestyle that runs its course.
Okay.
It's not for everybody all the time.
Right. It was fun.
Yeah. It was terrible too. It was beautiful, and it's really funny in retrospect. But those were hard times. I mean, you're in basically a tenement building apartment with, a can of Goya beans, and that's what you got. And then you're chasing a pigeon that keeps somehow getting into your kitchen, and it's crazy.
It's always the same pigeon.
It's always the same. Well, yeah.
I'm just picturing
that reminds me of this great book, Lonely Londoners, by Sam Selvin.
Yes.
And they eat the pigeon that does that.
Yes, they do.
They eat the pigeon, I'm pretty sure.
I was just picturing you with like you're just like you in like a little apartment, but with the most like amazing instruments around you.
Oh, there were.
And it's just one pigeon just walking into frame.
Yeah, I had a vibraphone set up, and my remnants of drum set that was being cannibalized for parts probably.
But I don't think and correct me if I'm wrong, but just knowing you for the time I've known you, I don't think anyone was going to make you live any other kind of life.
I don't know. Yeah.
At that moment in time, like you said, it had that chapter of your life.
Well, the good part about it was by the end of it, I really had nothing to lose by going to the other side of the planet.
Right.
and it just coincided. Mike Mike Pettis, had been in town. He was visiting in New York, and this was like when I was really at the end of it. I was just like, I can't, this is not good. This has been a great, inspiring thing that will feed other work, but I can't live like this. And so I was not afraid at that point to leave New York, and which is a thing for a native New Yorker.
How did you sustain yourself in China?
I was hired as the sound engineer for the venue, and the real reason was to kind of like teach drums to these musicians that were kind of getting it together.
And how long did you live there?
I lived there for about 2 years.
Now, a lot of the things we've been talking about in our conversation, you mentioned, the lack of and then slow grow of diversity of content at Columbia. You mentioned how important it was for your father when you were first learning to learn the music of your culture. So what was the cultural, we'll come back to the cultural diversity and conversations in America. I'm curious to know for you personally, those 2 years in China, what was the cultural difference, shock, good, bad?
Yeah, it was very shocking.
Okay.
I still remember like my very first cab ride from the airport to the bar, to the venue.
Okay.
I wanted to get to work right away too. I was just like, but that was very scary. It lost its shock, that the driving over time. It's just a different system. There's a lot of people in Beijing, and that personal space thing is you got to get over that real quick. Otherwise, you're just walking around angry all the time.
Did you feel welcomed at first?
Yeah, I did. It was a very loving community. It was so interesting because I know punks, and I guess I am one, and I know like people with marginalized folks who like have to make do and make other moves just to survive and just even for their own mental health, to create things and not always having those resources. So I felt a family connection pretty quickly with a lot of the community. I learned a lot about the language and about the culture there from Chinese musicians.
And what prompted you after those 2 years to come back to the States? Why not stay?
Well, China is still China, even if you have good friends. It's an interesting place. It's a wonderful place. It's beautiful, but it can really get. Also, I think it was a yearning to come back home that is very normal, but especially if you're from New York, there's just no place like it on earth, and you miss it if you're away for a while. You forget the stuff that's not so great about it too. But anyways,
2020 is always.
Yeah.
In hindsight, it's always rose-colored glasses.
I think there was a couple of incidents that kind of freaked me out. Like I definitely was interrogated at one point because of a minor visa issue, and surrounded by a lot of officials in uniforms.
And we're referencing the Chinese government.
Yeah, and then there was a time where I was traveling to renew a visa from Beijing to Hong Kong, about on a 30-something hour train ride, which is a very common trip, or it was. I guess. There was, on that train ride, there was someone who was following me who spoke very good English and was very interested in what I was reading, and I was like, damn, this is getting real weird.
What were they perceiving you to be a threat of?
I don't know. I was reading a book called Red Dust, which was definitely not allowed in China. It was a 1980s. I think he's in exile in London at this point, but it was a writer who wrote very directly about the time in Beijing around Tiananmen Square and that incident and stuff like that. So it was famous for all the wrong reasons, I guess, in China.
So you leave China, you return back to the States. Do you go back to New York first?
Yeah.
And then, just moving ahead a little bit in our conversation, you end up here in Northeast Pennsylvania, and you've been here for about 4 or 5 years?
Yeah.
And you've done a lot of projects, a lot of work, DJing, performing as a musician, audio engineer, your work with the IATSE union, as you mentioned before. What did you find, let's say, year one, Northeast Pennsylvania Scranton Art Scene, and your thoughts now?
Very different.
Okay.
That goes to show you really do need to be available, make yourself available, and get out there and reach out to people and not necessarily have that thing. I think when you come from New York too, it's easy to be kind of arrogant about things. I learned much more about what America really is by living here, and I mean that in the best way, and in a little bit of a scary way too. I moved down here right leading towards the elections of 2016, which was a very interesting time to be in Scranton. It was a little frightening, walking around, thinking the thoughts I had, and also maybe, it's a new place, so it's always a little strange. But like seeing those I'm not going to mention any names, but like seeing these trucks in the downtown area with these epithets, and like, you know, I'm a Latino, so I'm like, well, these people want me dead. What am I doing here? Obviously, that's an exaggeration, because obviously not everybody was feeling that way.
But, I mean,
Obviously.
But when you see, I mean, just a little, I mean,
It's a little intense.
I can totally see that,
It's a little intense, and like, you know, there's a lot of that. You know, in New York, there's all sorts of things that simmers underneath the surface, but it's so mixed up that you really do have to be face to face with people from all over the world at different times, and you just, when you're really face to face with it, I've noticed that people, it tones down that stuff a bit. It's usually when you're in your own group with your own sort of kind of whatever, your own kind or whatever that is, and we get into groups and we get real dumb.
So touching on politics and the engagement of politics, or unfortunately what we're seeing a lot right now is certain causes and situations that aren't receiving government support as they should. You are in the process of planning your second fundraiser for Puerto Rico, is that correct?
Tragically, sadly, yes. It's very necessary. I have a lot of family that's down there right now. One cousin in particular, Tamara Garcia, she's working on, well, it's actually, let me see, it's two of them. It's all three of them. Gus, Yomi, and Tamara. They're all basically doing their best to organize. I know Yomi is working under tents and tarps to get high school students to graduate, because everything's, you know, messed up, and that's mostly in Guanica, in the southern part of the country. Interesting slip. Of the island Puerto Rico, I called it a country. That's funny. I've been living in Ipa. That's interesting.
That's humanity.
But yeah, no, but it's also like, it kind of reflects on like what's wrong with the situation.
Worse, I mean,
the fact is, these are American citizens who are not getting attention, especially throughout American history. The relationship has been fraught with basically theft on the mainland side.
Would you agree, and just, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, would you agree that that really boils down to systemic racism?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. You're talking about a document that's only like 100 years old or more, the Jones Act, where the language is, you know, typical colonial racist language, colonialist language, where, you know, these are people who cannot support themselves because they're not quite human. It's basically what it comes down to. And you see in this administration a reflection of that, the tragedy of that thought running its course through history.
What do you think is something that we in mainstream, which, you know, you and I and everyone around us, from the media perspective, because we know how bad the situation is.
Do we?
But well, I was just gonna say that we get the sense that we know it's bad, but I also gather from other people I talk to that have a much stronger connection that we don't even know the half of it.
What's going on in Australia is really terrible, but when I'm only seeing crispy koalas, and I'm like, I know the humans that I love and care for are like hurt and can't live a normal or healthy existence right now because of this disaster.
Are receiving a fraction of that.
That is not getting the attention it needs to get as American citizens. I mean, we give more attention to people who aren't in our own country in some instances that it just baffles me. I don't want to conflate those two things. I want to be clear. Those are both terrible things, and I feel for my people. I have friends in Australia, and I feel for them, and it's a reflection of what the hell is wrong with
both things can be
climate
awful.
change.
Both things can be awful and terrible and deserving of attention.
Exactly, exactly. And I think that sometimes the way our attention gets divided, and how like we're so vulnerable.
So you and fellow musicians of the region are going to be organizing one, if not two, benefit events.
I'm hoping to get some musicians from Puerto Rico, but definitely getting musicians from the NEPA community involved, and other businesses and other creative folks who want to contribute in any way they can.
Can you give us an email address that people can contact you when they see this, if they want to be involved, donate, and support this?
Yes. Right now, the best way to get in touch is personal. This is my own email. And that's payasoj@gmail.com. PAYASOJ@gmail.com.
There's so much more I wish we had time to talk about. You are in the process of creating a John Coltrane tribute?
Yes, working on that.
Okay, fabulous. What and why specifically John Coltrane, in a sentence or two?
I'd say, like, I think he's one of the most moving, spiritual artists in American music, and I think these times call for something to unite people.
I do typically end the show with a series of rapid-fire personal questions. I'm going to do that real quickly, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
You wake up in the morning, coffee or tea?
Coffee. Bustelo. Black.
Okay. Favorite color?
Blue.
Most recent book you can think of that really spoke to you that you read?
Okay, it's a collection of short stories. It's called New American Writers.
What TV show are you binging these days?
I really love Old West Wing, like the first few seasons.
I have watched, oh my God.
The energy, that dynamic is crazy. Aaron Sorkin is nuts, man.
I watched that show 10 times. I think somewhere in the back of my like pseudo-liberal brain, I think that Bartlett is president right now.
Yeah, I do. It's easy to do that.
Right.
It's easy to slip into that because that's kind of like what, us blue folks like to see.
It is a little,
the humanity going on.
It is a little weird to watch it now looking back thinking, oh, we thought that's what politics was. Like that,
yeah,
like that.
It was a dream.
Yes.
It was a dream state.
It was
a lot of it was like, I guess, and that also shaped how we, must have thought about Clinton.
I completely agree. Favorite, okay, if you could snap your fingers right now and magically give us a meal at this table, any combination of from any restaurant or cook in general of Northeast Pennsylvania, what would it be?
Thai rock Thai, duck noodle soup.
Okay.
Oh, more?
That's it.
That's a pretty good portion there.
Okay. What would be one side dish you might bring to the table?
One of those real big salads from Eden.
Okay. Okay. I'm sensing a lot of Adams Avenue attention here because you live in the downtown area.
I live in downtown area. Yeah.
Great. Last question, and this seems to be the one that people get the most stressed about, believe it or not. What is your favorite coffee shop in Greater Scranton region?
I know why they get stressed out about it because like everybody works at one of them at some point.
And again, I stress this.
I worked at Duffy's.
Okay.
In its second incarnation.
Okay.
And I had a blast working with those people. So I'm gonna have to go old school with that. Yeah.
And say Duffy's?
Yeah.
Great. I tell everyone it's not an insult to the others.
Sumo's is awesome because their food is real good.
Can I just tell you,
all of them are great.
They're all amazing. I'm so relieved because every single person I've talked to so far has said Adesso, and I'm just waiting for someone to have a different opinion. So I'm
Adesso's got good coffee and beautiful, wonderful ambiance.
I agree completely.
And there's a lot of art right next door to check out.
Right on. Justin, we could have gone hours and hours more. I'm so grateful for your time and attention. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
You can reach out to Justin via email. You can also find him on Instagram at PAYASOJJP. I've been Conor Kelly O'Brien. Thanks for joining us for this conversation.